Venturing into the online world, tread carefully. Today, we reveal how simple chats can lead to serious legal troubles, highlighting the dangers of interacting with minors and the complexities of online consent. Learn to navigate these digital pitfalls. Watch now to safeguard your virtual interactions.
So the goal here is to keep you out of trouble. And to do that, you got to make sure that you know you're talking to an adult. Anytime there is a fantasy involving juveniles or a discussion involving juveniles. And related to that, we also had a number of clients, because you and I have an interesting practice, my friend, but we also had a number of clients whose fantasies are of the kink variety, or rape fantasies, or rough sex fantasies. And it certainly is not unlawful for consenting adults to share certain interests that may lie outside of the mainstream. That's totally legal. But you do have to be very clear in your communications and in your conduct after you've had these communications, so that both sides are on the same page as to where reality begins and ends and where fantasy lies. Otherwise, you're potentially exposing yourself to criminal liability. You could be accused of making certain threats when in fact you're just role-playing. And if you meet somebody after these steamy chat conversations, thinking that they want to engage with you in the same way as they have been describing it online, you may be mistaken. And you may now be looking at sexual assault allegations.
Yeah, it's okay to have a fantasy, but when you have those fantasies, you need to include a disclaimer. I know this is only fantasy. Even if it's one sentence that you write or tell the people, make sure it's recorded. Make sure it's documented. So that way, you stay out of trouble.
And another issue that often arises in situations involving internet dating is the issue of consent. Someone could meet a stranger online, discussions take place, people likely exchange some sexually promiscuous messages, maybe they exchange some photographs, they might discuss some activity they want to engage in, or share some fantasies. Then they meet in person, relations take place, and later a person is accused of sexual assault. How do you protect yourself from something like that?
Well, once again, you have to be clear in your communication, because when you're meeting somebody for the first time on the internet, whether it's for sex or any other person, you've never talked to this person before. You don't know what their background is. You don't know what their motivation is. So in order to protect yourself, you have to have clear communication. You have to document it. Even if it's a tape recording of yourself and the partner, and you take your phone out and you record, my name is Joe Smith, and I'm here with Jane Doe, and both of us consent to sex with each other, or something like that. But there needs to be something that you put out there so you protect yourself, because not everybody's fantasy is reality.
Yeah, preserving evidence is really something that comes to mind when you talk about these recordings. I think a lot of people are engaging in online dating or internet dating, and they might, while they're enjoying the activity in the process, they might nonetheless feel embarrassed about it because of societal stigma, or maybe because of issues related to fidelity or infidelity. But what we oftentimes see is that people will have an act with the person they met online, and then they go back to their regular life and they quickly delete any and all evidence of this illicit affair, or any and all evidence of this meet or date. And sometimes in our line of work, that can be really dangerous, because some of these sites you're on may not preserve your private communications. And if you've had these discussions about sexual fantasies, about kink fantasies, about rough sex fetishes, or any other things that you want to do to one another, and suddenly you delete them after you've acted on them, and then you're accused of sexual assault, well, you may have just lost evidence that this was a planned consensual activity between two consenting adults, as opposed to you meeting somebody for a different reason and then forcing yourself on them. And I think that's quite dangerous for an individual.
That's right. You should always maintain records of your communications of consent. It's very important in order to you to have a happy and healthy relationship with these people. I mean, you really need to keep track of things.
I also think that when we talk to people online, Roland, we have to remember that we're interacting with human beings. And human beings have emotions, human beings have feelings, human beings have needs, and we're talking about personal or emotional needs, not just sexual needs. And so what I think oftentimes happens is that the internet dating cheapens the interpersonal relationships between folks, and it results in people acting crudely. Perhaps people acting in a way they would not have acted with a person if they had known them, or maybe if this was a person introduced to them by common friends or family members. And so I think when sex becomes a commodity, when interactions are reduced to a transactional level, you expose yourself to additional dangers that perhaps if that's what you plan to do, which you shouldn't, but if you plan to do it in that way, if you engage in a transaction, you need to have a clear understanding of what transaction is about and how this transaction is going to proceed. And what happens, as you've always taught me, what happens if there is a breakdown in the middle of this transaction?
Just like a businessman does a contract. This is a transactional nature, and you should have a contract too.
I mean, if that's what a person decides to do, I know that in our colleges, it's an interesting thing that you brought up a contract. I personally think it's absolutely ridiculous as far as our society is concerned that we're teaching kids in colleges to sign off on sex contracts or consensual contracts, where folks are now discussing in writing, these are the things that I permit you to do to me if we have relations, and these are the things that I don't permit you to do.
So, I know how you feel, but the freshman orientation for my daughter, when she went to college at UC Santa Barbara, we're there as parents. And one of the things during freshman orientation, they were handing out consent forms. If you're going to have sex, and of course, me and her mother looked at each other and said, what is this? But at the same time, when you start thinking about, it's easy to make these accusations. If both people just sign a quick piece of paper ahead of time, then there's no misconception.
I mean, as a lawyer, I tend to agree with you. But as a person, as an adult, as somebody who believes that we shouldn't reduce human interactions to transactions, I also feel quite uncomfortable with the idea of having to sign a piece of paper where we can say, okay, I can kiss you on the left shoulder, but not on the right. It just seems ridiculous to me.
Yeah, well, I don't think we need to go into these details. But if two consenting adults just sign a form, I consent to have sex with you, you consent to have sex with me, and all that entails, it pretty much protects you.
I think that would be an extreme form of protection, but I understand your point. The other way to address it is the rule that I think we would like most people to live by, which is, how about you just be a decent person, be a gentleman. When you're interacting with a lady, you had sex, you got what you have come for, you wanted to have sex with this person you met online, great. But, be also sensitive to their means as a human being afterwards. Don't just disengage completely like it meant absolutely nothing. Don't cheapen it. Don't reduce it to just a sexual transaction. I think if folks just take the higher road and act a little differently, that could probably cut down on some really hurt feelings and perhaps reduce the number of false allegations out there.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that statement, that it's always better to be a decent person and a decent human being, but the internet has reduced this to a transaction. And when you're entering a transactional business, it doesn't really cheapen it because you're already in a transaction. You need to protect yourself.
The last thing I want to say on the subject is that I don't know if you remember this or not, but we had a client a while ago who was in the kink community. And he wanted to protect himself against potentially false allegations of certain acts during these sessions he was having with multiple partners. So we actually had an associate of ours draft a contract for him, which I think was an interesting assignment for our employee, to say the least.